The air feels brittle, ready to snap. Not the cold of winter, but the thin, sharp chill of 1,000 tiny shards of glass suspended mid-breath. It's the kind of cold that sinks not just into bone, but into the very marrow of you, settling there like an unwelcome tenant paying rent in anxiety. My fingers trace the empty space on the mantelpiece. A hollow ache echoes the physical void. The silence in the room isn't silence at all. It's the deafening absence of things that should be here, things that have always been here. My grandmother's porcelain figurine, delicate, frozen in a perpetual dance. My mother's silver locket, heavy with the ghost of her perfume. These weren't just objects. They were anchors. And now they are gone, swallowed by a void I can't comprehend. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. We built a life here, piece by careful piece. Like assembling a mosaic, each memory a tiny stone pressed into the mortar of shared time. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was ours. A comfortable rhythm. Mornings started with the smell of his coffee. Evenings ended with the soft click of the lock turning. Weekends were for quiet walks, for planning small dreams, for the comfortable predictability of a life intertwined. My world revolved around the warm gravity of our shared orbit. I was the keeper of our home, yes, but more than that, the keeper of our history. The heirlooms weren't just decor. They were the threads connecting me back through generations, a lineage of strong women who had loved, lost, and endured. They were pieces of my soul, externalized. They were a promise whispered across time. You are part of something bigger. They sat on the mantelpiece, on the antique dresser, their silent presence a constant comfort. A grounding force in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. I'd inherited them piece by precious piece, each one arriving with a story, a memory, a weight of love that felt heavier than any gold. There was the embroidered shawl, passed down from my great-grandmother, the one who crossed oceans. You could almost feel the ghost of her hands in the intricate stitching, the resilience woven into the thread. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. I kept it folded carefully in an old wooden chest, its surface worn smooth by countless years. Opening that chest felt like opening a portal to another era, a whispered conversation with the past. There's the series of miniature paintings, watercolors of landscapes I'd never seen but felt I knew, carried by my grandmother through revolutions and wars. Each tiny brushstroke held the history of a journey, a survival. They hung in our living room, their quiet beauty a stark contrast to the everyday noise of life. They demanded reverence, a moment of stillness to absorb their stories. And of course, the jewelry. The silver locket, its surface dulled by time and touch, held a faded photo of my mother, her smile both distant and achingly present. The pearl necklace, heavy and lustrous, worn by every woman in my line on her wedding day. The small, ornate music box that played a tune so delicate it felt like a secret. Each piece was a repository of memory, a connection to the women who had shaped me. They were the physical manifestation of my identity, the tangible link to my roots. They were my most prized possessions, not for monetary value, but for the immeasurable wealth of history and love they contained. They weren't just things, they were people. They were memories. They were me. He seemed normal. Distant sometimes, yes, lost in work, lost in his own head, the way partners can become after years together. You grow accustomed to the quiet spaces between you, mistaking them for comfortable silence instead of widening rifts. He wasn't effusive, never one for grand gestures, but his presence was a constant. Solid. Reliable. Or so I believed. We talked about the future, planned small renovations, discussed our days over dinner. The mundane ballet of married life. There was no storm on the horizon, no dramatic signs of impending disaster. Just the slow, almost imperceptible drift. Like two ships moving apart in calm seas, so gradually you don't notice the distance until the other vessel is just a speck on the horizon. I saw his tiredness, attributed it to stress. I saw his preoccupation, thought it was big decisions at the office. I saw the subtle withdrawal, explained it away as needing space. I was a master of rationalization, a skilled architect of denial, building walls of normalcy around a foundation that was silently, steadily crumbling beneath my feet. I poured my energy into making our home a sanctuary, a place of peace and continuity. I dusted the heirlooms with care, rearranged them with reverence. They were the silent witnesses to our life, or what I thought was our life. They stood sentinel as we ate, slept, argued, loved. They were meant to be passed down to the next generation, carrying these stories forward. They were the future, not just the past. My desire was simple, really, to nurture this life, to honor the past, to build a future rooted in the strength of those who came before me, to live a quiet life of substance and love. Then, the quiet broke. Not with a bang, but with a whisper of emptiness. It was a Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable day that slices your life into before and after, without preamble. I was tidying the living room, a simple, habitual task. My hand reached for the porcelain dancer on the mantelpiece, ready to wipe away an invisible speck of dust. My fingers closed on.
Air.
A jolt went through me. A tiny, electric shock of disorientation. Where did it go? I scanned the mantelpiece. Empty. The space where the miniature paintings hung?
Bollocks.
A cold knot formed in my stomach. I moved to the dresser. The locket was gone. The music box. The pearl necklace from the velvet-lined box. My breath hitched. This wasn't misplacement. This was
gone.
All of it. The sudden, gaping void felt physical, like a punch to the gut. The room tilted. The silence now felt heavy, oppressive, filled with unspoken questions. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of disbelief. They can't be gone.
They couldn't be.
These were irreplaceable. These were pieces of history, pieces of me. My mind scrambled for explanations. Cleaning? No, I always did that. Put away for safety? Why? And without telling me. Robbery? There were no signs of forced entry. Everything else was untouched.
Just
the heirlooms. Only the heirlooms. The air in the room grew thick, difficult to breathe. My initial confusion curdled into a chilling certainty. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. But who?
And why?
The sheer impossibility of it warred with the stark reality of the empty spaces. The silent witnesses were gone. Panic began to set in, a cold wave washing over the shore of my composure. I searched the house, frantic, ripping open drawers, pulling books from shelves, looking in the most illogical places, driven by the desperate hope that I had simply misplaced them all simultaneously. An exercise in futility. The emptiness was everywhere. The house felt hollowed out, echoing my own growing despair. Where was he? He would know. He had to know. My husband. I called his office. No answer. I called his cell. It went to voicemail. A new layer of ice formed in my stomach. This wasn't like him. He always answered. The silence from his end was as loud as the silence in the house. My mind, in its panic, started spinning theories, each one more terrifying than the last. Had someone been in the house? Someone he knew? Was he involved? The thought was a serpent coiling in my chest, tightening its grip. I dismissed it instantly.
No.
Not him. He wouldn't.
He couldn't.
But the question, once planted, began to sprout tendrils of doubt, insidious and suffocating. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, moving through the motions, calling him sporadically, each unanswered call a fresh stab of fear and confusion. The house felt wrong, violated, even though nothing else was taken. It was the selectivity of the theft that was most unsettling. It wasn't random. It felt personal, deeply personal. When he finally came home, hours later, the air between us was thick with unspoken accusations, though I hadn't voiced them yet. His face was pale, drawn. He looked
guilty.
Or maybe that was just the lens of my fear. Where were you? My voice was thin, reedy. I work, he stammered, avoiding my eyes. Late night, the heirlooms are gone. I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other, raw with panic. His head snapped up. His eyes met mine for a fleeting second, a flash of something I couldn't quite decipher. Surprise? Fear? Then it was gone, replaced by a carefully constructed mask of concern. Gone?
What do you mean, gone?
His voice was too calm, too controlled. It didn't match the tremor in his hands, the tension around his mouth. I explained, my voice rising with each empty space I described. He walked to the mantelpiece, looked at the bare spots, his expression a practiced portrait of shock. But
how?
Was the house broken into?
No.
Nothing else is missing. I watched him, searching for a flicker of genuine emotion, a shared sense of loss. There was none. Just that unsettling calm. He suggested calling the police. His eagerness felt forced. Too quick. Too definitive. It was then, in that moment, watching his performance, that the serpent in my chest uncoiled and struck. A cold, hard certainty solidified. He knew. He wasn't surprised. He was pretending.
He was involved.
The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My own husband, the man I shared my life with. He knew. And he wasn't telling me. My initial grief for the lost objects was instantly overshadowed by a crushing wave of betrayal. The foundation wasn't just crumbling, it had evaporated. The mosaic of our life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The days that followed were a blur of police reports, interviews, and the suffocating presence of his carefully maintained facade. He played the part of the concerned husband to perfection, asking if I was okay, lamenting the loss, feigning confusion. But I saw the cracks now. The subtle shift in his posture when the subject came up, the way his eyes darted away, the forced nature of his sighs. Each performance was a fresh insult. The police found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no leads. They treated it like a simple burglary, albeit an unusual one. They saw objects of monetary value. I saw my history, my identity, dismissed as a statistic. The emptiness in the house was now mirrored by an even deeper emptiness within me. The heirlooms were gone, yes, but so was the marriage, the trust, the future I thought I had. He moved through the house like a ghost, or perhaps I was the ghost, haunting the ruins of a life I no longer recognized. The silence between us wasn't just the absence of words, it was the deafening roar of a million unspoken accusations, a chasm that widened with every breath we took in the same air. I started to watch him, truly watch him, through eyes stripped bare of love and trust. I noticed things I hadn't before. Late nights that weren't work. Hushed phone calls in another room. A new, unfamiliar scent clinging to his clothes. The serpent of suspicion grew into a monstrous beast, consuming everything. The suspicion gnawed at me, sleepless nights spent replaying conversations, scrutinizing his behavior. The pieces didn't fit the narrative of a simple theft. Why only the heirlooms? Why the lack of distress from him? The questions circled relentlessly, a flock of vultures picking at the carcass of my marriage. I started looking, not just for the heirlooms, but for answers. I checked his computer history when he was out. Nothing obvious, he was careful. I looked through his phone records, deleted. Always deleted. He was covering his tracks. The realization that he was actively hiding things from me, that he was calculating and deliberate in his deceit, was a cold shock. It wasn't just a mistake, a moment of weakness. This was planned. What was he planning? What did the heirlooms have to do with it? My mind, fueled by betrayal and fear, started piecing together fragments. A few months prior, he'd asked oddly specific questions about the history of some of the pieces, their origins, their significance. I'd thought he was taking an interest. Now it felt like reconnaissance. He was gathering intelligence on his target, my most precious possessions.
Why?
The only answer that made any twisted sense, the one that felt instinctively true despite the horror of it, was that he was taking them. Not stealing them for money, not randomly. Taking my heirlooms. Why would he do that?
Who would he give them to?
The chilling answer slowly formed, a venomous bloom opening in the darkness. Another woman. The pieces clicked into place with sickening finality. The late nights, the phone calls, the distance, the new scent. He wasn't just having an affair. He was building a new life, a life he intended to furnish with pieces of my past, my identity. The heirlooms weren't just gone. They had been given away.
To her.
To the woman who was dismantling my life one lie at a time. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a violation of the deepest kind. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was trying to erase me, to replace me entirely, using the very objects that define my connection to my lineage, my history, my future. He was giving her my past. The anger that surged through me was volcanic, a righteous fire consuming the last vestiges of grief and confusion. It was a cold, hard fury, not the kind that burns brightly and fades, but the kind that smolders, waiting for its moment to ignite. He had taken my history and tried to gift it to his future. He had weaponized my most cherished possessions, and he thought he had gotten away with it. He saw me as the grieving wife, lost in her sorrow, easily deceived. He saw me as a victim. That was his first mistake. The turning point wasn't a sudden flash of insight, but a slow, deliberate hardening of my core. The initial shock, the panic, the confusion, the crushing pain of betrayal, they all coalesced into something cold and sharp. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a target, yes, but a target who was now armed with the truth. He thought he was playing chess. He didn't realize I was learning the board, anticipating his moves. The heirlooms weren't just sentimental objects anymore. They were evidence. They were the key to exposing his deceit, to reclaiming not just my possessions, but my dignity, my agency. My determination wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, relentless. It settled in me like stone. I would not let him get away with this. I would not let her have my history. I would not be erased. I wouldn't confront him, not yet. That would only warn him. Instead, I would wait. I would watch. I would gather information, not just about the affair, but about the heirlooms, about how he might have planned to move them. I became a silent observer in my own home, a spy in the ruins of my marriage. The atmosphere shifted. What he saw as my continued grief, my withdrawal, was actually a strategic retreat. I was mapping the territory, identifying weaknesses, preparing for a battle he didn't even know was coming. The house, once a sanctuary, became a battleground. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the tension of anticipation, the quiet hum of a trap being meticulously set. I lived inside the moment, yes, but also outside of it, watching him, waiting, calculating. I began the painstaking, secret work of gathering proof. It was like piecing together a shattered mirror, sharp fragments of suspicion, moments of odd behavior, financial transactions that seemed out of place. I had to move carefully, leaving no trace. He was smart, or at least he thought he was. He deleted phone logs, used cash, covered his tracks. But lies leave faint trails, like a scent only the truly motivated can follow. I started with small things. Checking credit card statements for unusual purchases or travel. Looking for shipping records, looking for anything that hinted at a package, especially one going overseas. It was slow, tedious work, hidden in snatched moments when he was out of the house, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and grim determination. I found a charge on a shared card for a high-end packing service weeks before the heirlooms disappeared. The date matched a time he'd been working late. It was a small thing, easily dismissed as business expenses, but in the context of the missing heirlooms, it screamed confirmation. The cost was exorbitant, far more than shipping business documents. This wasn't just sending papers. This was sending something valuable, something that needed careful handling. Then, tucked away in his home office, hidden beneath a stack of unrelated papers, I found a crumpled shipping label. Part of it was torn, but enough remained to see the destination city, Paris.
Paris.
Of course. Cliché, but devastatingly real. My heirlooms, my history, packaged up and sent to Paris, likely destined for the hands of a woman who had no right to them, who knew nothing of their stories, their weight, their meaning. The label also had a tracking number, partially obscured. I carefully copied the visible digits, hoping it was enough. Every discovery was a fresh wave of nausea, followed by a hardening resolve. The crumpled label felt like a physical blow, the destination city a cruel mockery. My grandmother's and mother's treasures, meant to stay within our family, within my line, now hurtling across an ocean towards her. The indignity of it was suffocating. But alongside the pain, a cold clarity settled. This wasn't just about hurt anymore. This was about restitution. About justice. About proving that he couldn't just erase my past and build a new life on its ashes. I researched international shipping laws, customs regulations. It was a dry, frustrating process, but every piece of information felt like gathering ammunition. What happened if a package was improperly declared? What if the contents were undervalued? What if there were questions about ownership? The legal labyrinth was daunting, but it offered a potential path. A path to intercepting his carefully laid plan. A path to reclaiming what was mine. I started gathering documentation for the heirlooms, old photos, insurance appraisals. Thank God I'd had them appraised years ago, just in case. Anything that proved they belonged to me, their history, their value.
It was a race against time.
The package was already in transit. Would it reach her before I could act? The fear was a constant drumbeat beneath my skin. The deepening crisis wasn't just the loss of the heirlooms. It was the imminent reality of them slipping permanently out of my reach, disappearing into the life of his mistress, a final, brutal symbol of his contempt. All seemed lost. He had won. Unless there was an obstacle he hadn't accounted for. An external force. I looked at the partial tracking number, the destination city. Customs. International customs. They were the gatekeepers. They scrutinized packages, especially those with declared values that seem low or contents that raise flags. My heirlooms, packed by a professional service, were likely valuable. If he'd declared them dishonestly to save money or avoid suspicion, that could be a vulnerability. Or if he'd listed the contents deceptively. My research confirmed it. Customs officials had the power to hold, inspect, and even confiscate goods if there were discrepancies, ownership issues, or potential illicit activity. The sheer absurdity of the situation, my husband sending my family history to his mistress overseas, was the very thing that might make it raise a red flag. It wasn't a typical transaction. It wasn't a straightforward shipment. I held the crumpled shipping label, the partial tracking number a lifeline in the dark. It was a long shot. A tiny chance in a million. But it was a chance. It meant his plan wasn't foolproof. It meant there was a point of interception. A point where the cold, bureaucratic hand of international shipping might just catch his betrayal in its gears. It wasn't about revenge anymore, not purely. It was about retrieving what was rightfully mine, yes, but it was also about justice, about consequences. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he could simply erase me. But history, like a package improperly declared, has a way of catching up to you. I used the partial tracking number, combined with the date and the shipping company name I'd gleaned from the charge, to try and track the package online. It was like trying to find a single grain of sand on a beach, but I was relentless. Days turned into nights, hunched over the computer, searching, guessing, trying different combinations of numbers. Nothing. The tracking information was either unavailable, the number was too incomplete, or he had used a method I couldn't trace. Despair began to creep back in, cold and suffocating. Had I missed my chance? Was it already there? Was she holding my grandmother's locket right now? The thought sent a fresh wave of agony through me. I pictured her, a stranger, touching the pearl necklace, wearing the embroidered shawl, utterly oblivious to the history, the love, the pain woven into every fiber. The thought was unbearable. I felt the walls closing in. The crisis deepened. The heirlooms were gone. The proof was insufficient to stop him. The legal avenues seemed impossibly complex from this distance. He was winning. He had taken my past, and the future felt bleak and empty without it. I sat in the silent house, surrounded by the ghosts of things that were gone. the emptiness louder than ever. It felt like the end. The absolute, crushing end. The point where you just give up, where the weight of it all is too much to bear. I considered walking away, just leaving, disappearing myself. Let him have his new life, his ill-gotten treasures. Let the pain consume me in private. The thought was tempting, a dark abyss promising surcease. But then I looked at the empty spaces again. The bare mantelpiece, the vacant hooks, the naked dresser. I didn't just see missing objects. I saw the faces of the women who had owned them. My great-grandmother, crossing the ocean, carrying her life in her hands. My grandmother, surviving revolutions, protecting her art. My mother, facing life with quiet strength, leaving behind a piece of her heart in that locket. They didn't give up. They didn't disappear. They endured. They fought, in their own ways, for what was theirs, for their history, for their survival. Their resilience was woven into those heirlooms, into the very fabric of my being. I was their descendant. I carried their strength, their determination. I would not be the one to break the chain. I would not be the one who let their legacy be stolen, erased, gifted to a stranger. A cold fire ignited in my belly, different from the hot anger before. This was a controlled burn, a strategic fire. I wouldn't just grieve. I would fight. The heirlooms weren't gone yet. Not irreversibly. There was still the faint possibility of that partial tracking number, of customs interception. It was a thread, thin as spider silk, but I would cling to it. I would explore every avenue, exhaust every possibility. I wouldn't confront him. Not directly. Not in a way he could easily deflect or lie his way out of. My fight wouldn't be loud and emotional. It would be quiet, precise, and utterly devastating. My determination hardened into an unbreakable steel. I would not lose. Not this.
Not them.
The call came on a Thursday. The phone rang, a jarring sound in the quiet house. It was an unknown number, an international code. My hand trembled as I answered. Hello. The voice on the other end was formal, accented, speaking English with careful precision. This is Agent Dubois, from French Customs. My blood ran cold. Customs. French Customs. Paris. The crumpled label flashed in my mind. We are calling regarding a package addressed to a Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois, shipped from your address, Agent Dubois. Celeste Dubois. A relative? His mistress? The name felt like a confirmation and a cruel twist simultaneously. The sender is listed as husband's name, my husband. Caught. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear now, but from a surge of pure, exhilarating adrenaline. We have questions about the contents of the package, the agent continued. The declared value seems inconsistent with the items inside, which appear to be antiques, possibly of significant value. There are also discrepancies regarding the ownership declaration. The sender listed himself as the owner, but we require further verification. Are you familiar with this shipment? The agent's voice was calm, procedural. He was just doing his job. But for me, his words were a symphony of vindication. He hadn't gotten away with it. Customs had flagged it. The universe, or fate, or just sheer bureaucratic probability, had intervened. This was it. The moment. The trap had sprung. My mind raced, years of internalized politeness battling the icy clarity of my newfound resolve. I needed to be calm.
Clear.
Provide information, but control the narrative. This wasn't the time for emotional outpouring. This was the time for cold, hard facts. Yes, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I am familiar with the contents of the package. They are my family heirlooms. I explained, concisely, calmly, that they were irreplaceable antiques, inherited property, significant sentimental value. I stated clearly that my husband had no right to send them, that he was not the rightful owner, and that they had been taken from our home without my knowledge or consent. I didn't accuse him of theft directly, not in those words. I presented it as a legal issue, an ownership dispute, backing up the customs agent's own suspicions about the declaration. I explained that I had documentation, appraisals, photographs, even insurance policies, listing me as the owner. I offered to provide everything immediately. Agent Dubois listened patiently, his questions precise and focused on the legal and ownership aspects. He explained that based on my information and their own assessment, the package was being held indefinitely pending clarification and proof of ownership. He thanked me for my cooperation, stressing the importance of rightful ownership in international transit. He gave me an email address to send the documentation and a case number. He said he would need to speak with my husband as well, as the listed sender, but based on the conflicting information, the package would remain under customs control. As I hung up the phone, my hand still trembling, a wave of something akin to triumph washed over me. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was colder, sharper. Satisfaction. He hadn't won. His plan had been intercepted by a bureaucratic wall he hadn't anticipated. And I was the one who had been contacted. I was the one they were asking for verification. I was the key to the Heirlooms' fate. The power had shifted, dramatically, completely. He had thought he held all the cards, moving my possessions across continents in secret. But the system, designed for transparency and legality, had caught his deceit. The universe had not abandoned me. It had simply been processing the paperwork. I sat there, the silence in the house now feeling different. Not empty, but charged with anticipation. The cold, brittle air was gone, replaced by a cool, determined stillness. I began gathering the documentation, my movements precise, focused. Appraisals, photos, scanned copies of insurance policies, old family letters mentioning the pieces. Every document was a weapon, a piece of undeniable proof. I drafted the email to Agent Dubois, attaching everything, laying out the case clearly, factually. I didn't mention the affair. That was irrelevant to customs. This was about property, about ownership, about his fraudulent declaration. Just as I finished the email and clicked send, his car pulled into the driveway. I heard the front door open, his footsteps in the hall. He walked into the living room, briefcase in hand, looking tired, perhaps a little stressed, but still wearing the mask of the mildly preoccupied husband. "Hey," he said, dropping his keys on the hall table. He paused, noticing the strange atmosphere. "Everything okay?" I looked at him, truly looked at him, the man who had shared my bed, my life, and had systematically tried to strip away my history and give it to another woman. The mask he wore felt flimsy now, transparent. The calm determination inside me gave me a strange sense of power. I didn't respond right away. I just held his gaze, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. He seemed to sense the shift, the air changing. His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his features. Before he could ask again, his phone rang. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen. His face went instantly pale. The number was international. He answered, his voice tight. "Hello." I watched him, utterly still. I didn't need to hear the other end of the conversation. I knew who it was. I knew what was being said. Agent Dubois. Asking about the package. Questioning the declaration. Mentioning my name. I saw the color drain from his face. I saw the shock register, the disbelief, the frantic scramble in his eyes as he tried to process how this could possibly be happening. He stammered out answers, trying to backtrack, trying to lie, but his voice rose in pitch, becoming increasingly frantic. He mentioned needing to call his lawyer. He denied that the items belonged to me, then instantly contradicted himself. The calm, procedural voice on the other end of the line was dismantling his carefully constructed lie, piece by piece. And he knew it. He knew he was caught. He knew the Heirlooms weren't sailing smoothly to his mistress in Paris. They were sitting in a sterile customs office, flagged, questioned, their fate now resting on proving ownership. Ownership he didn't have. And then, he screamed. It wasn't a yell of rage. It was a choked, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated panic and defeat. A sound stripped of all composure, all pretense. He stumbled backward, clutching the phone, looking not at me, but through me, his world collapsing around him. He knew I was there. He knew I had heard. But he also knew in that moment that his mistress wouldn't be receiving her gift. He knew the plan had backfired spectacularly. He knew the heirlooms were gone from him, likely forever. And he knew I was the reason why. Because customs had called me. He finally dropped the phone. It clattered on the floor, still connected, the faint, tinny sound of the customs agent's voice a distant echo of his ruin. He looked at me then, his eyes wild, panicked, accusatory. "You," he whispered, the single word laced with venom and disbelief. "You did this." My smile didn't waver. It felt cold, brittle, but deeply satisfying. "I didn't do anything," I said softly, my voice calm, controlled, a stark contrast to his disintegration. "I just answered the phone. And told them the truth. The simple, undeniable truth that those heirlooms were mine. That he had taken them. That he had lied. The truth that had caught him in a net of his own making, woven from deceit and arrogance." He stared at me, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. The man who had believed he could quietly erase me, replace me, had been blindsided by the very system he tried to bypass. His betrayal hadn't led to a new life with a mistress. It had led to bureaucratic limbo and public humiliation. He had tried to steal my history and gift it to another, and in doing so, he had forfeited any claim he had to his own future, to his own integrity. He had lost everything in his attempt to take what wasn't his. The aftermath wasn't dramatic fireworks, but a quiet, almost anticlimactic dismantling. The marriage was over, definitively, irrevocably. There was no shouting, no grand pronouncements. Just the cold, hard fact of his betrayal, exposed not by my accusation, but by an official inquiry triggered by his own actions and sealed by my testimony. He couldn't deny it, not to me, not to the authorities. The documentation I sent to customs was irrefutable. My ownership was clear. The discrepancy in his declaration was clear. The package was formally confiscated by French customs, held as evidence in a case of attempted fraudulent export and false declaration of goods. The heirlooms were safe, at least from his mistress. They were in a secure facility, awaiting the outcome of the legal process. It would take time to get them back, I knew. A long, frustrating process of paperwork and international bureaucracy. But they were not gone forever. They were not with her. That was the victory. A quiet, profound victory achieved not through confrontation or pleading, but through patience, observation, and leveraging the simple, undeniable power of truth and official procedure. He moved out quickly, defeated, stripped of his arrogance. There was no plea for forgiveness, no attempt at reconciliation. Just the bitter taste of consequences he hadn't anticipated. The house felt different again. Not empty and hollowed out, but quiet and still, like the eye of a storm after the winds have died down. There was immense sadness, yes. The end of a marriage, the shattering of a life built on lies. The pain of betrayal leaves scars that run deep, twisting and turning like poisoned roots. But there was also a profound sense of relief, of vindication. I had faced the deepest betrayal, the attempted theft of my history and identity, and I had not only survived, but I had turned the tables. I had used his own actions, his own deceit, against him. The heirlooms were not just objects anymore. They were symbols of resilience, of enduring strength, of the continuity of a lineage that could not be easily erased. They were proof that even in the darkest moments, armed with truth and determination, you could reclaim what was stolen, piece by painstaking piece. The future felt uncertain, fragile even, but it was my future. Built not on his lies, but on the bedrock of my own strength and the quiet, enduring legacy of the women who came before me, whose stories were woven into the very fabric of the treasures I was fighting to bring home. The empty spaces on the mantelpiece, on the dresser, were no longer voids of loss, but placeholders for a history that was being reclaimed, a future being rebuilt. The air was still, but it no longer felt brittle. It felt quiet, waiting. Waiting for the heirlooms to come home. Waiting for the next chapter to begin. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.